Good evening, everyone. Welcome, friends, to the Benson Center event on the Hamilton, the musical panel. My name is Shilo Brooks, and I'm Associate Faculty Director of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization and a faculty member and director of the Engineering Leadership Program. As I said, welcome to tonight's panel. We are so excited you're here. We're really excited to be here. Alexander Hamilton, the man behind the musical. I want to start off tonight with a little bit of thanks for the Benson Center staff, Betty and Lily, and especially in this case, Betty Kilsdonk for putting together this panel. She loves Alexander Hamilton, and this is a testament to that love. So thank you, Betty, for making this possible for us. I want to say at the beginning, there are a lot of technical moving parts in tonight's panel, so bear with us because we're going to be transitioning between speakers and segments, and there's a video clip, and so you know how it goes. But in our panel tonight, we're going to hear from 3 CU faculty members, and then in a special video segment, we're going to hear from the Tony Award-winning sound director of the Hamilton musical. All of our panelists tonight are interested in different aspects of Hamilton's career and the famous musical that bears his name. And so we look forward to hearing from a lot of different angles: economics, politics, and the theater. Each panelist is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and we're going to have an audience Q&A at the end. So if at any point during the event you have a question, you can go ahead and submit it using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And if your question happens to be for a specific panelist, you should include their name in your question. So if it's, for Taylor or Elizabeth or whatever the case may be, or Marcus, you need to type that. Otherwise, our panelists are going to feel free to weigh in on your questions as they would like. So that'll be great too. We're also going to run a few Zoom polls tonight, and you can participate in those by clicking in the poll box. That's going to pop up later on your screen, and we'll announce the poll, and you can participate. And then at some point we'll announce the results, and maybe we'll reflect on those results in the Q&A. And finally, this is the most exciting part of the evening in my view. Again, thanks to Betty, our Associate Director at the Benson Center. Everybody in attendance tonight has been entered in a drawing for a copy of the Hamilton soundtrack, but it's not just any copy of the Hamilton soundtrack, it's autographed by Lin-Manuel Miranda, the man himself. So we'll announce the winner at the end of the event, and we'll get in touch with you via email because we have all your email addresses if you registered for the panel, but you'll know if you won it by the end of the event. So let me now introduce our 3 CU faculty panelists. I'll introduce the guest video speaker later, but our first panelist, they're going to go in the order in which I introduced them, is Markas Henry. And he's an associate professor in the Department of Theater and Dance. And until recently, he was also the associate chair and director of theater. He specializes in costume and scenic design, and much of his work is in the area of new plays and musicals. He's an artistic company member at Denver's Curious Theater Company, and his regional credits include work with Colorado Shakespeare Festival, which as everyone knows is awesome, Opera Colorado, and Theater Aspen. He's got some Broadway credits selected that include the original productions of Thoroughly Modern and Beauty and the Beast, the great classic, both of which won the Tony Award for Best Costume Design. He's done some film work, including Leading Ladies, and one of my favorites, everybody, the holiday classic Elf. If you haven't seen it, best movie ever made. And he was costume producer for Britney Spears, in fact, in 2001 and 2004, her US World Tours, which I suspect is no small task to be costume producer for Britney Spears World Tours. It sounds like a giant production. He's got an MFA from the University of Connecticut, and he's a 28-year member of IASTE, the United Scenic Artists Local 829, which is the union for theater designers and crafts artisans. And so we're going to hear from him first. It should be excellent about how the sausage gets made in the theater. Second, though, we've got Taylor Jaworski, who is assistant professor of economics, my good friend. He's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He got his PhD in economics from the University of Arizona. He did a master's degree at the London School of Economics and Economic History and a BA from George Washington. His research focuses on the economic history of the United States in the 20th century primarily, and he teaches courses on US and European economic history. And then finally, we're going to hear from the Benson Center's own Elizabeth Eastman. She is the 2021 Senior Scholar in Residence at the Benson Center, and she teaches seminars on Abraham Lincoln and the development of American political institutions. She's got a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate School. She's got an MA in liberal education from the greatest school in America. I'm not biased, but it's called St. John's College. Have a Google, check it out. and a BA in French Literature and Civilization from Scripps College. And her teaching experience includes American colonial history, the American Revolution, American intellectual history. She does classical and modern political philosophy, political science, liberal studies, and she specializes in particular on the great books of Western civilization. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're also going to show a pre-recorded segment with a gentleman named Nevin Steinberg, who is the Tony Award-winning sound designer of Hamilton. He was gracious enough to answer some faculty and student questions, and I'll introduce him later just before that segment. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and put up our first poll. You can take that at any time. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition to Markas. You're going to have to move the poll box that just popped up on your screen around, but you can go ahead and take the poll, and I'm going to transition to Markas. So why don't you kick us off, Markas?
Well, thank you, Shilo. I appreciate the introduction, and I will do my best to show how the sausage is made. It is my pleasure to be a part of this panel with my esteemed colleagues and scholars, Elizabeth and Taylor. But first, I feel like I need to come clean in the fact that I feel like a bit of a fraud speaking to you today because I am not a scholar. I have no one area of research or scholarship that I subscribe to as a theater designer. I dream up, concoct, and create make-believe people and make-believe worlds through all time and throughout the galaxy. So hard to specialize in any one thing, especially when most of it's make-believe. But what I can say with pride is that I'm a master artist in my field of theater. And that one of my areas of greatest knowledge comes from my time working on the creation of new plays and musicals. And it's from that vantage point that I will speak to you today. I think it is fair to say that Hamilton has attained the seminal distinction of becoming one of the most important pieces of popular art of our age. In other words, pop art. A fact evidenced by the inclusion of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton costume in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History as an artifact of our time. A distinction that belongs along with Archie Bunker's chair from All in the Family and Judy Garland's ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, and even Abe Lincoln's top hat. How did a piece of musical theater land in this lauded category of pop art? What drove the audiences to this theatrical production? I will venture to say that it was the music, first and foremost. And while a few lucky souls were able to see the initial run at the Public Theater and some of the early performances of on Broadway, by the time it opened at the Richard Rodgers Theater on Broadway, it was already on fire across the country and indeed around the world. Again, I believe that the music gave ordinary people who rarely, if ever, listened to musicals, the ability to dive into the story through a musical form that was familiar to them, and that is rap and hip hop music. This popular form of music allowed folks to instantly find something familiar in this story that resonated in their life. And that allowed this historic story to jump 230 years into the present day. This rap hip hop form also meant that BIPOC folks, generally not represented on stage, let alone in any positive historic context, were now front and center. They had full access into this world and into the musical. So history all of a sudden started to look a lot like all of the American population, particularly that of the underrepresented classes and races in cities and towns, large and small, across America. So instantly, the music allowed the musical to transcend social barriers, and it allowed nearly every American to see themselves on stage as part of the founding family of this country. Notice I didn't say founding fathers. This musical and the rap and hip hop form has allowed the non-musical theater human to reimagine history and place themselves in it by hearing it through a familiar, trusted, accessible, and contemporary musical art form. The artistry of the musical obviously starts with the actual story, the book and the music, the source material created by Lin-Manuel Miranda and given to the creative team and led by the visionary director, Thomas Kail. Kail assembled his trusty team of collaborators the choreographer Andy Blankenbuehler, the designers and scenic David Corrins, Paul Tazwell in costumes, Charles LaPont doing hair and wigs, Howell Binkley doing lighting, and Nevin Steinberg as the sound designer. One of the words that jumped out to me as I was imagining what I was going to talk about today and thinking about Hamilton is the word rhythm. Yes, there is the rhythm of the music, the actual beat the music is set to, but there is also the rhythm of the storytelling, the rhythm of how and when the scenery moves, the rhythm of how and when we see color and shapes emerge in Paul's costumes, the rhythm of the lighting, how Howell paints with light and sculpts the movement of light into and emphasizing the beat and the rhythm of the music. The story is told exquisitely through the rhythm and movement of the choreography. Andy Blankenbuehler sculpts and creates story advancement through the movement. This creative collaboration is emphasized beautifully and artfully with the double turntable and the floor, allowing a myriad of storytelling possibilities with the help of dozens and dozens of props and pieces of furniture and humans moving artfully and beautifully through space. A history lesson unfolds in front of our eyes. In the first song, first through the literal movement and rhythm of the scenery ensemble, but most importantly, it unfolds through the words. Words, 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 and more words. Words that assault the audience with information and compressed history lessons. The rhythm in the first song starts slowly with a certain economy and beat, which allows our ears to adjust to this musical and rhythmic form. I equate this to the time needed for an audience's ears to adjust to the rhythm and iambic pentameter of a Shakespearean production. Gradually, the rhythm and the complexity of the language increases, an artful device which allows our ears to adjust and absorb and enjoy the onslaught of info, the story, the words. The success of the sound design of Hamilton is in no small part due to the artistry and technical prowess of the sound designer and our recorded guest this evening, Nevin Steinberg. Nevin had the challenge of making sure every seat in the audience hears every single word, no matter who is speaking, no matter how quickly they are speaking, or how many people are speaking at the same time, all the while making the music and the experience aurally satisfying and artful. It is always a huge challenge to sound design a musical, constantly adjusting the volume of the orchestra, the turning on and off of body mics hundreds of times throughout a single performance, adjusting to the conditions in the theater, the ventilation system, the barometric pressure, how the sound is absorbed by the winter coats worn in the colder months. Who knew? Constant changes. No performance is ever exactly the same. But Hamilton centers on rapid-paced dialogue, at time in the form of rap battles, our modern equivalent to enlightened gentlemanly debates in the 18th century. And the lyrics advance the story, so every word is vital in keeping pace with the advancing plot devices. And I believe Nevin and his team are superheroes for the artistry and technical mastery involved in this production. Not only can one hear the words, but the words sound beautiful and satisfying at the same time. There's one last thought, one last kind of personal reflection that I have about Hamilton and its place in the firmament as a piece of popular art, pop art. In my estimation, the only time that I think a musical hit this big within the form of popular music of the day was Jesus Christ Superstar and the driving rock and roll score of its day. I grew up listening to my older sister's album of Superstar, and the rock drive of the music and the story offered my generation a new view of what a musical can be and what a musical can sound like. No more standing in front of a fancy curtain and belting, "There's no business like show business." I know I never heard Guys and Dolls blaring on an 8-track or cassette car coming out of any car window ever. But I do remember hearing Superstar everywhere and it resonating in the zeitgeist of its day, a distinction that I argue it shares with Hamilton. Superstar first hit the stage, then there was the film, then the 8-tracks and albums entered the mainstream. With Hamilton, we had the musical, then the CD hit the mainstream before the film followed suit. One example of how times and the influence of music morphs over generations. This music came to the people, average people who rarely, if ever, follow theater and its offerings. Because of this, it is a piece of pop art. What caused this? Was it the perfect timing of having the first Black president in the White House? No doubt this new version and vision of America had an influence, along with the timing of the Chernow biography. However it came to us, I'm thankful that it did. How will this musical influence future generations? Not only theater practitioners and creators, but the average American. How many are now digging into and immersing themselves in history, in constitutional law, in political science, and in economics? Will this musical give entry to future BIPOC leaders, both in politics and industry? Time will tell. But these thoughts venture into my esteemed colleagues' territory, so I will sign off. And I thank you for your time and attention. And I hope that I've been able to make a little bit of sausage and help you see how it is made in the theater, at least one point of view. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Markas. Thank you so much. We owe Markas, in fact, a double debt of gratitude, because not only was he willing to come on and share his expertise in the theater, which, as you can see from his analysis, are quite impressive, but he also managed to get the Tony Award-winning sound designer, so to record some pre-recorded video answers. So I'm going to introduce that person now, and then we're going to roll the tape on that and let you hear some of the answers that Nevin Steinberg gave to faculty and student questions, and then we'll come back to our live panel. So let me introduce Nevin really quick. He's, of course, as we've said, the Tony Award winner, and he's an acclaimed sound designer in Broadway, particularly for the production of Hamilton. As you heard Markas say, much depends on the skill of the sound designer. He's got a lot of current Broadway projects, past Broadway projects. Those include Hadestown, for which he won the Tony, Tina, the Tina Turner musical, Dear Evan Hansen. He's also got a lot of other credits, including a Tony Award nomination, in fact, for the Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella on Broadway. And he was the audio consultant for the Stern Auditorium at Carnegie Hall. And as I said, the theater students at CU and faculty asked him 3 questions. So here are those questions, and here are his responses.
Hi, everybody. This is Nevin Steinberg. I'm the sound designer of Hamilton, and I'm videoing in from Sydney, Australia, where we're about to mount the latest production of Hamilton in one of the only places in the world that's doing live performance right now. So I'm very excited. I'm in my 10th day of quarantine out of a 14-day government-mandated quarantine, and looking forward to getting outside. It's summer here, and enjoying working in a theater again. A few of the most memorable sound design moments that happened during Hamilton occurred very early on in the development process. One of them was the development of the echo of Burr in Wait For It. This was an idea that came up in discussions actually while we were workshopping the show. We hadn't even put the show on its feet yet. And this was a couple of years before the Broadway opening in a space on 52nd Street and 10th Avenue. We were doing a workshop of the show with a reduced band. The cast was staging Act 1 and then was going to do a stand and sing of Act 2. And when we were discussing Wait For It, the director, choreographer, and Alex Lacamoire, the arranger and music director and orchestrator, said, we wanted to put this echo on Burr's voice. Could we do it? Will we have to record it? We should schedule some time. He said, unless we could try and do it live. And I and my team said, let's try and do it live. That's what we're here to do, to experiment. And we did. And over about a 15-minute break in the action, I and my team furiously tried to figure out how to capture Burr's voice and play it back in the theater while he was performing the song. And that sketch, which was pretty successful, became the whole idea that we executed both off Broadway and then on Broadway and in all future productions. That bit of trickery is still very difficult to perform by the sound engineer, actually, who's doing it manually and in time with whoever's playing Burr at that moment. It's a pretty incredible moment. It says a lot about the kind of creativity that happens collaboratively in a room. Another fantastic memory, it was off Broadway at the Public Theater and in Helpless Satisfied, when Angelica and Hamilton meet in the Satisfied section, in the Rewind section. Hamilton kisses her hand, and the ensemble, who basically occupy the space, perform as scenery almost in our show. Their choreography is like moving scenery, do a little lift in the background. If you've seen the movie, if you've seen the show, you'll see it happen just as Alexander touches his lips to Angelica's hand. And Andy Blankenbuehler, the choreographer, came running up the aisle and said, "Hey, can we have a sound during that? Is there something we could add to that moment just to lift it up?" And this is while Howell Binkley was lighting them and doing a little lift in the lighting. And I created a very small sound effect, which was the intake of breath and a little cymbal swell that just accompanies that. And it's very subtle. It's barely heard, but it is one of my favorite moments. It tells a lot about how other departments can influence you in your choices and inspire you to do little things that make the show even better. Sound designers get involved in shows, Broadway shows and other shows at different stages of the process. On Hamilton, I was listening to demos of the show several years before we ever opened on Broadway. And that director, Tommy Kail, is sort of generous with involving me as early as he can in a process, exposing me to the material, introducing me to the other players, and getting me involved in understanding what the goals of the piece are and the directions it's heading, and any way I might be able to help move it along in its development. Other times you get called in at the last minute. Sometimes you're pinch hitting for someone. Sometimes you're replacing a sound designer and there is no time. And you're coming into a project that's fully formed in a lot of ways and you're having to sort of reinvent it in your own image or adapt what's been done before. And then there's also the middle ground where you're just sort of along for the ride as part of the process. Depending on the creators and the director, I can often get involved in dramaturgical discussions, and those are always a lot of fun. I have a lot of experience with musicals, so sometimes, depending on who the creators are, they like to take advantage of that. Others don't, and that's okay too. I'm here to serve, and any way I can help make the production better, whether it be through audio and sound design or any other of my other skills or experience, that's a positive for me and a positive for the production. My advice for young theater professionals emerging out of training into this profession, post-pandemic particularly, is to keep learning. I know that even during this hiatus, as I've been calling it, I've been doing a lot of professional development. I've been reading a lot, researching a lot, and taking online courses, as many as I can, both from manufacturers and free offerings, plus some paid seminars and webinars and things like that. But even if your budget doesn't allow for fee-based training, there's a ton of available resources from the manufacturers and from the societies and guilds that oversee our industry, trying to help people get trained up on the latest and greatest. I highly recommend those services and those programs if you can find them and if you can make time for them. I've been delving myself into post-production right now, audio for video, and experimenting with demo software from various manufacturers to ease that transition and learn about workflow, which is something I didn't know much about. And it's been fun and hopefully will really pay off as we develop more digital content, and also just to keep me and my brain happy during this idle time.
Terrific. We can discuss some of the things that he said in the Q&A as well. So if you have any questions that maybe Markas could shed light on based on what Nevin said, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A. We're going to transition a little bit from the theater to the history of the man behind the musical. So before we do that, though, I think we can maybe put up the results of our first poll just so you can check them out. Everybody take that in. We're not going to discuss it right now because we want to move along and have as much time for questions as we can. But as you can see, there is an extraordinary number of people who have seen a $10 bill. So that's great. But let me introduce our next speaker. Taylor Jaworski is the professor of economics, whom I mentioned earlier, and he's going to transition us into the man behind the musical by talking about some of Hamilton's economic thoughts. So Taylor, have at it.
Hi, Shilo. Thanks. Thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, so my job is to talk a little bit about some of Hamilton's kind of political or economic thinking. And so I'm going to jump into doing that. So I think Alexander Hamilton was one of the most innovative thinkers in American history. I mean, I think the musical makes pretty clear that he was extremely productive and had writings that stretched across today what would be several sort of distinct fields: law, philosophy, political science, and economics. So my co-panelist, Elizabeth Eastman, is going to talk about some of Hamilton's political thought. I'm an economist by training, and so I'm going to talk about some of and an economic historian in practice. And so I'm going to talk about Hamilton's sort of economic thinking. And in particular, I'm going to spend my time talking about Hamilton's influence on the development of the US financial system, which you get a bit of a glimpse of in the musical, and some of his other writings on economic policy, and then hopefully try to provide some kind of perspective on how Hamilton possibly continues to influence our kind of political and economic thinking, or political thinking about the economy today. So I should say that I'm not a historian in particular of the early Republic, the period that Hamilton lived and in which his ideas were most influential, or were at first influential. And so when you hear me talking today, you're going to hear me drawing on some of the research that's been done by economic historians who have spent much longer sort of diving into Hamilton's thinking along the lines of economics. And so I want to kind of recognize the economic historians Richard Silla and Doug Irwin as people who have written a lot on this, and who you can find on Amazon, and if you want to learn more about that side of his thinking. But to jump into some of the kind of the important things that Hamilton wrote, he's the author, or he was the author of several sort of, like just a huge range of writing on economic policy, but probably 4 documents stand out in this regard. So he wrote 2 reports on public credit, one that sort of focused on what would today be public finance, or aspects of public finance, and another that was titled a report on public credit, but had to do with the reasoning behind wanting to establish a national bank. He also wrote a report on the mint, sort of ideas behind sort of creating a currency and what you would need to do that. And then he wrote a report on the subject of manufacturers. So all of these particular documents were commissioned by Congress and influential in their time. So commissioned around the late 1780s and early 1790s. They were influential in their time. And I think importantly, they sort of are texts that economic policymakers or economists or economic historians will go back to in thinking about sort of this period in history and some of the very good ideas that Hamilton had. So Hamilton's thinking about the operation and the role of the financial system and public debts are the ones that are referred to most often in the musical. And many of these are drawn from the reports on public credit that I mentioned. I'm going to talk about these ideas last. And instead of what I'm going to do is start by talking about Hamilton's report on the manufacturers not in too much detail, but in a little bit of detail. This is something that doesn't really appear in the musical, but was still influential in its time. The report is a kind of policy document designed to sort of try to push Congress at the time to enact some policies that Hamilton thought would be beneficial in various ways for the development of the American economy. The report specifically, sort of as it's remembered today, makes recommendations related to tariffs. So in some cases, he wanted to make tariffs higher on final goods. In other cases, he wanted to make tariffs lower on raw materials. And he also went about proposing a system of subsidies for domestic manufacturing and government assistance to facilitate skilled immigration. Together, these ideas are probably most prominently remembered in US history as sort of providing the foundation for something that came to be called the American system. And you can think about the American system as something that sort of stood on the other end of the spectrum from something like the laissez-faire doctrine of free trade that's commonly associated with Adam Smith. So kind of as a theoretical matter, Hamilton starts the report by making the case for government promotion of manufacturing. So this is something that he sort of thought would be a good idea and wanted to find ways that the government could productively do this. To him, this was justified because of the benefits associated with a rapidly improving industrial sector. So he sort of foreshadowed or foresaw the potential benefits of having a developing manufacturing center. And I think probably more importantly, from his perspective, the need to try to counterbalance the encouragement that was given to industries by other countries. And so I think this is the first place in my talk where we can see that the insights that Hamilton had really do justify, I think, his reputation as a very much a forward-thinking sort of economic analyst. He recognized the coming importance of industrialization, the thing that would ultimately provide the foundation for a lot of American prosperity. He articulated a kind of early version of an infant industry argument in favor of protection, and was aware of the ways in which the international trading environment could be distorted by sort of the bad or not very helpful policies of foreign governments. So in February 1792, Congress passed legislation for some of the subsidies that Hamilton proposed, in particular related to cod fisheries, kind of an obscure thing, but this is what they did this is one action they took based on this report. But in general, this was not the way in which kind of American sort of economic policy and trade policy evolved kind of in the early part of the Republic, having to do with something that does show up in the musical, a lot of kind of constitutional disagreements between Hamilton and people like Madison and Jefferson. But all of the tariffs that Hamilton proposed in his report on the manufacturers were implemented by Congress in the spring of 1792. So this is, I think, a place where kind of Hamilton's legacy enters sort of the modern or the popular imagination, where he gets a kind of reputation as being in favor of protectionism. So this isn't quite right. And so I want to talk a little bit about this misconception. So Hamilton was a kind of realist in trying to understand like how to implement policy that he thought would be beneficial. And so he, in trying to design this system, really wanted to emphasize sort of the role, not that tariffs could play in providing protection, but the role that tariffs and the revenue derived from them could play in state building. That this was a way that the US government was going to get revenue. In fact, he went so far as to, I think, speak out against sort of tariffs that would be designed for protection, at once predicting that some of the tariffs that would come later, not under the Federalist administration, but under the Republican or the Jeffersonian Republicans during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, would actually be quite bad for the economy. And in fact, he predicts in the 1790s a very bad effect of what would become Jefferson's embargo of all trade, when in its time having a very substantial impact on the U.S. economy, something on the order of 5% or around what kind of the current pandemic has wrought on us over the last month or last year or so. And so with that, and sort of with that perspective that Hamilton was taking, not on sort of a narrow thing, trying to provide protection, but on a broader thing, trying to sort of find a way to sort of facilitate the development of the American government, and then through that, the American economy, I want to turn to his contributions to the financial system. And so it's not, I think, too much of a stretch to say that Hamilton, in his years as Treasury Secretary, oversaw a financial revolution of the United States. You can think about this in four distinct ways. He created what became sort of the foundation for the institutions of public finance in this country, ways to sort of raise revenue and spend that revenue, ways to restructure the US government, or the various debts associated with the Revolutionary War. He advocated for establishing a national or central bank. He established, he advocated for establishing the US dollar as sort of the currency that would be backed by both gold and silver, and innovation at the time, and that would sort of provide the way in which exchange that exchange would happen in the US economy. And then finally, he did a bunch of things promoting the growth of the banking system, securities markets, and business corporations. So there's a lot in this, and I think you can think about Hamilton as kind of being one of the early proponents, or an early proponent of recognizing sort of the power and the role that finance could play in being a leading sector in economic growth. And this is something that he really took from his experience with the Articles of Confederation, and from his, I think, very deep understanding of early economic development on the European continent. And the result really was a true financial revolution. Hamilton just had a dramatic impact on stabilizing the US economy in this early period, and in moving the US economy in the direction that it would sort of make it into the world economic power that it became over the course of the 19th century. And so if I could summarize kind of my take on Alexander Hamilton and his economic thinking, I would say that he was really a creative and expansive in his views on economic policy and the role of government. But I think it's a little bit too easy sometimes to sort of place him very neatly on a present day ideological spectrum. I think, sometimes people read Hamilton as sort of being or advocating for an activist role of the government. But I think we should always try to, when we read those passages in Hamilton as sort of him advocating for the government to do more, we should always look for the ways in which he's actually trying to design institutions that will allow government to do good things, but also is also always concerned with constraining government excesses or corruption. I think along the same lines, if we sometimes sense that he's kind of too much in the pockets of Wall Street, as the musical sometimes will accuse him of, or which characters in the musical will accuse him of, sort of financiers and markets running amok, we should also think about sort of the way in which, or the broader vision he had for the role that finance could play in building state capacity and in mobilizing the human and physical resources of the United States. So I'll end by saying that, Hamilton, he wasn't always right. And the things he said weren't always true with respect, or haven't come to be true sort of in the context of economic theory. But I think it's unmistakable that Americans today are sort of the beneficiaries, or remain the beneficiaries, of his efforts to articulate a way forward, a path toward a more modern US economy. And his stamp on that is sort of undeniable. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Shilo and look forward to seeing you in the Q&A.
Thank you, Taylor, very, very much. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put up a second poll. So feel free to take this, and we want to get some information on who Alexander Hamilton was. Don't use Google. Don't Google it. You should do it based on your own knowledge and not rely on smartphones for your intelligence. So take that poll honestly. And next, we have our third and final speaker, Elizabeth Eastman, who's going to come and talk to us about some of the politics of Hamilton. So, Elizabeth, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm just delighted to be here and to be able to participate in this wonderful event. I teach, I'm currently teaching the the development of American political institutions. So this is quite timely. So first of all, I want to extend my thanks to Shilo and certainly to my fellow participants, and as well to the staff who have worked very hard to make this event successful. So my colleagues on the panel have introduced Hamilton from two different vantage points. My contribution is from a political perspective. Hamilton's life encompassed some of the most extraordinary times in America, including its founding. To talk about Hamilton is to talk about America, and to talk about America is to talk about Hamilton. He was that influential and controversial as well. Hamilton arrived in America as a teen in 1772 when the country was still under British rule. The colonists were subservient to King George III and the British Parliament. And while there were times that this relationship was advantageous to both, it became clear to those living in America that it could not last for a long term. Hamilton was a student in New York when the Boston Tea Party took place, the protest against taxation, as political agitation between the mother country and the colonists grew, the British enacted punitive measures. Within a year, Hamilton published a pamphlet, A Full Vindication of the Measures of the Congress. Now, which Congress, you might be asking yourself? It was in fact the Continental Congress that was formed by the colonists to respond to the British measures. And I want to give you the full title of Hamilton's 35-page essay because it's a good introduction to the keen mind that he possessed. So the title is A Full Vindication of the Measures of the Congress from the Calumnies of Their Enemies, in answer to a letter under the signature of A.W. Farmer, whereby his sophistry is exposed, his cavils confuted, his artifices detected, and his wit ridiculed, in a general address to the inhabitants of America and a particular address to the farmers of the province of New York. Veritas magna est et provalibit, truth is powerful and will prevail. That's the title. So that just gives you some indication of Hamilton, really the first piece. There's evidence that there may in fact be a prior piece, but this really is the first piece of 35 pages to respond to a letter and something that, he's jumping on the stage, and boy, is he jumping on the stage. I'm going to offer one quotation from that essay because again, Hamilton tips his hand. Quote, "'Tis my maxim to let the plain naked truth speak for itself, and if men won't listen to it, 'tis their own fault. They must be contented to suffer for it. I am neither merchant nor farmer. I address you because I wish well to my country, and of course to you, who are one chief support of it, and because an attempt has been made to lead you astray in particular." Close quote. So that's how Hamilton made his debut in print. So a reply to Hamilton's essay brought another reply a response from Hamilton. In this case, instead of 35-page response, he gave an 80-page essay. And I'll give you the title of this one as well. The Farmer Refuted, or a more partial and comprehensive view of the dispute between Great Britain and the colonies, written in 1775. So he's a very young man. But nonetheless, the ideas were flowing and he was very articulate. And I'm going to quote another passage from this essay as well, because it foreshadows some of the themes and ideals that informed the foundation of the country that would be announcing independence from Britain, but that was not yet quite on the horizon. "The fundamental source of all your errors and sophisms and false reasonings is a total ignorance of the natural rights of mankind. Were you once to become acquainted with these, you could never entertain a thought that all men are not by nature entitled to a parity of privileges. You would be convinced that natural liberty is a gift of the beneficent Creator to the whole human race, and that civil liberty is founded in that and cannot be wrested from any people without the most manifest violation of justice. Civil liberty is only natural liberty, modified and secured by the sanctions of civil society. It is not a thing in its own nature, precarious and dependent on human will and caprice, but is conformable to the constitution of man, as well as necessary to the well-being of society." And I quote just one more sentence. "Upon this principle, colonists as well as other men have a right to civil liberty, For if it be conducive to the happiness of society, and reason and experience testify that it is evident that every society of whatsoever kind has an absolute and perfect right to it, which can never be withheld without cruelty and injustice. Hamilton's mention of the natural rights of mankind, natural liberty, civil liberty, and the happiness of society were among the themes that would dominate the debate prior to declaring independence at the founding and continue well into the development of America. So let me just remind you, Hamilton is writing these ideas when he's still in his teens, and yet he's already foreshadowing some of the most fundamental ideas and themes that will stay with Americans even through today. We're still debating some of these very same ideas. So to returning to Hamilton's life, prior to proclaiming independence in 1776, America was already at war with the British. And now we're introduced to yet another facet of Hamilton's career. He served in various military capacities, including captain of a New York artillery company and in command of New York and Connecticut light infantry battalions. And his best known position was that of aide-de-camp to General George Washington, who was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War, and who was to become the first president of the United States under the US Constitution. Now, Hamilton was not a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was only 19 years old in the summer of 1776. He was, however, defending the country at this time while serving in the Continental Army in New York City when the Declaration of Independence was drafted. He served in several political capacities as well, military career and a political career as well. He represented New York as a delegate to the Continental Congress when the country was governed under the Articles of Confederation, and served as well as a delegate to the Annapolis Convention, which was the first effort to address the inadequacies of the Constitution, of the inadequacies of the Confederation. He was also elected to the New York State Assembly. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention and signed the Constitution. Once the country was on a new footing under the newly ratified Constitution, Hamilton served as the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, as we've already heard. And as well, he became the Inspector General of the Army. So it's really remarkable in that he served both at the state level and was very influential in New York State politics, but as well served at the national level. Now, when he was not serving in the official capacity, he practiced law. And in 1801, he founded the New York Evening Post to reinvigorate political debate of the Federalists. And if you can kind of think back to who was president in 1801, Thomas Jefferson was. It was the waning days of the Federalist Party and the Republican or the Jeffersonian Republicans, Jeffersonian and Democrat Republicans. There are various names that are attributed to this new political party. Was in the ascendance, and Hamilton, given that he was one to write and he wrote well, it was very contentious. He thought, why not start a newspaper? So that was the entree and the beginning of the New York Evening Post. Regrettably, very sadly, his untimely death in 1804 at the age of 47 brought an end to an extraordinary life that contributed to laying the foundation of both a new nation and the financial means to perpetuate it. So Hamilton left us with a trove of writings, and I need only cite one fact about the papers of Alexander Hamilton that are available at the website Founders Online. And this is the fact: there are 27 volumes of documents, letters, pamphlets, and notes. Now, among his best known writings is, of course, the Federalist Papers. I'm teaching it in my class right now. It was published under the pen name of Publius. It was Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay who penned the essays that were published really throughout the states that argued for the ratification of the US Constitution by way of explanation of the provisions of the newly drafted Constitution. And I share with you Hamilton's opening lines to his fellow citizens who were called upon to deliberate on the newly drafted Constitution. And I quote this, and we know that Hamilton penned this essay, even though it was published under the pen name of Publius. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question of whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they're forever destined to depend upon their political constitutions on accident and force. Now, these words, reflection and choice, I choose them specifically because I think if we had to choose any two words out of the thousands and thousands of words that Alexander Hamilton penned, I would advance these two, because I think this is really what, this can sum up Alexander Hamilton's life. Now, was he an adversarial figure? Oh, most definitely. That's why I shared those two comments from the very young Alexander Hamilton, or the two quotations rather. Yes, he was adversarial, and he was always one to, engage in the argument and advance the argument, and to always kind of like the dog with the bone, I guess is another way to put it, if you want a nice visual. But it was in the best of all possible ways. It was done through argument. It was done through debate. It was done through written responses, extensive responses. I mean, I think if you'll allow me just one allusion to what we're suffering today, this reprehensible cancel culture where folks are simply condemned for their actions. No, that was not Alexander Hamilton. I think on the contrary, one of the reasons why he's become so popular is beyond the musical that makes him accessible to so many, he also represents the best of American traditions. Even if you disagree with him, at the end of the day, you still have to admire him for all that he contributed to making America, well, great. Gosh, isn't that a controversial statement these days? Right now, I invite you to look at his writings and read and reflect. So with that, I'll kick it back to Shilo, and we'll continue with the program.
All righty. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm going to ask our panelists to please turn your video back on. Taylor in particular. Okay, he's here. And our host seems to have dropped out. And so we can't display the results of the poll unless Taylor can do it, because it looks like Taylor's the new host. So Taylor, if you could display the poll results, that would be great. If not, don't worry about it. But we're going to start the Q&A. So everybody, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's the second poll results. Only 4% of people think he was the president, which is, I'll spoil it, it's false. He was not ever the president of the United States. So you guys, we know, didn't use Google. But the others are all true.
Maybe they read Wikipedia.
Yeah.
I always tell my students, don't read Wikipedia.
Right.
You never know.
Well, we've got some great questions that are already starting to roll in, and I want to pose them to you guys, but you should feel free to weigh in on any question you want. There's none that's posed to a particular person. If it is, I'll let you know. But here is the first question, which was that, Markas went over the cultural success of the musical. And this is a question I think all three of you could weigh in on, which is, how has the cultural success of the musical, as Markas described it, changed public perception of the founding and the founders? Don't everybody go at once.
I mean, I would venture to say that that maybe because there is now this visual of kind of the United Benetton colors of the founding folks, that all of a sudden there is entry for the ordinary people to kind of see themselves, even if that's not what it looked like, that they can just imagine themselves. And so I think that hopefully it's opened up people's imagination into the founding times. And certainly I think, we've seen an explosion of interest in people diving into various biographies of all the old dead folks of that time. And so I think that there's been a resurgence.
I'll add a couple of comments, and I sincerely appreciate Markas referring them to founding folks, just because, there's just some really wonderful women who are involved. Read the letters of Abigail Adams. She's just wonderful. And Mercy Otis Warren, her history, and on and on. I could do a presentation on them. But no, it's very much true. And I think this goes to dialogue and debate, and to speak more directly to the question. I think it's great. Why not? Now, I don't know that we're going to have Madison the musical. His life wasn't nearly as colorful as Hamilton. He was every bit as smart, and he was absolutely one of the sparring partners of Hamilton. But, you know, just think Ben Franklin, that would be a fun one. He had all sorts of, you know, crazy times in Paris and such. But no, why not continue? Why let this be the first of many? I absolutely encourage it. We had that wonderful movie on Lincoln. So it doesn't have to be confined to the theater, it can be to movies. And I think, you know, it's very rich. And I think opening the door a crack so that we can all rush through and really use our imaginations, I think is something that bodes well for the country, because I think we benefit from revisiting in a variety of media.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Taylor, since you haven't spoken yet, I'm going to go ahead and pose one for you. This is for you in particular, although anybody should feel free to weigh in. In what ways, this person says, is the economic infrastructure in modern America most similar to that of the America in which Hamilton lived? And what direction would the monetary system of the US have gone but for the work of Alexander Hamilton?
I mean, that's a hard sort of like counterfactual imagining of alternative worlds. I mean, I think that you can't see sort of, you can never draw, I think, especially going back that far in history, sort of back to a kind of almost pre-modern time for kind of American political and economic development. I mean, sort of at the beginning of that time, certainly the economy would become very different. But I think like Hamilton sort of hits on a lot of the themes that become important at different times over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century. I mean, thinking about the role of trade policy vis-a-vis other countries, you know, undesirable trade policies is an issue that is with us today, right? It's not only about sort of like protectionism versus free trade, but it's about trade policy in an environment in which many of the people we don't perceive as being, you know, kind of good faith actors or whatever. I mean, his ideas about central banking, about the financial architecture. I mean, again, like, I don't know if no one would have come along to have those ideas. That seems almost implausible. But Hamilton certainly was an advocate of ideas that would eventually come to pass. The thing that I would maybe say that sort of is not in his favor or sort of is a kind of side note to the many great ideas that Hamilton had is that it turned out that he sort of ended up having a very national vision of sort of economic development. And I think the thing that he didn't recognize is that, you know, as we move into the middle of the 19th century, the US economy faces financial crises, states face kind of crises of their own. And it's really at that point when sort of some of Hamilton's ideas for what should go on at the national level get sort of transported down to the state level. And so a lot of, for example, the bank creation that sort of Hamilton advocated for at the national level doesn't really come to pass in his time or kind of remotely his time, but comes to pass as states start to create and charter new banks. And that's a way in which I think Hamilton's idea sort of gets transformed in a way, but then goes on to have a life of its own that is, I think, very different from his imagining of that idea.
Thanks. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that one? You economists? All right. We've got a couple questions about this, and it's a difficult one, but it's an interesting one. Marcus, while you were speaking, someone said, you know, do you have a comment? But I think this is not just for you. I think this is for everybody. They say, do you have a comment about why audience members in New York City walked out from the performance of Hamilton? Another person asked a similar question. They say, we're discussing Hamilton and it was embraced by the culture, and it was. Well, that's a true thing. But this person says, I read that some people want to cancel Hamilton. I suppose this is related to the walking out on the production. How do you make sense of both the cultural embrace of this musical and at the same time, there's at least a certain strain of rejection of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not terribly familiar with all of the hullabaloo about that some of the negative aspects because we've heard very few reactions of negative, because it's been overwhelmingly popular. So I'm not really sure. Like the first question of what caused audiences to walk out, I actually did a quick Google search and I couldn't even find anything about audiences walking out. It brought up the Mike Pence attendance, and that had some controversy. But I don't know. I mean, I guess the thing I would say about the kind of the cancel culture, as Elizabeth was remarking a few minutes ago, that we've become such a black and white society that we've lost all of our shades of gray. And so all of a sudden, the fact that, I mean, maybe some of the cancel culture with Hamilton is the fact that, did it involve slaves? Was he a slave owner? All of a sudden it's like, oh, you're a bad boy. You're bad. We must strike you from history. Like all of a sudden, there is nothing redeeming in the human anymore because there was this terrible part of their past as well. And so, so I think that, when we look at things in a black and white manner, absolutely, he should be cultured. He should be canceled.
I mean,
but it's not that simple. You know what I mean? And so it's much more nuanced, I think, than that.
I mean, I think that when someone like Hamilton draws so much attention, via kind of through, kind of preliminarily through Cherno's biography, and then certainly more broadly through the musical, that it's sort of fair game that they become like a locus of debate about different time periods and different people and different issues. I mean, I was sort of struck. The New York Times reported on a kind of recent finding about sort of trying to understand to the extent to which Hamilton may have engaged in transactions related to slavery on his own behalf, on behalf of members of his family. And I mean, you can go and find the article in the New York Times, and it's quite interesting to read about. And I think you can read the commentary from some of the historians that are asked about this issue. And Joanne Friedman from Yale, kind of preeminent historian of the Revolution, says the history is a field that's written over years, not in one paper and not over months or days. And we'll have to see sort of how a particular finding shakes out, but sort of making sure that no particular figure is lionized is a healthy aspect of kind of historical writing and of remembering the past without having to resort to whether someone should or should not be, quote, canceled. I think that healthy investigation by members of a society who come from different perspectives is a perfectly reasonable thing to engage in. And Hamilton, he gets to be a founding father, and he gets all the scrutiny that he would have wanted as a result of that. He accomplished his mission, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just close out, given that we've got 27 volumes to mine of his writings. I think he has plenty of responses to all of these different controversies. And I'd say if anybody walks out, if you're going to walk out, then doggone it, I want you to write me a paper. I want you to give me one page on why you chose to walk out. That's probably what I'd tell a student. If you just find this to be so offensive or something that's just not worthy, why? And I want to hear, because I want to learn from you. So it's, well, he was controversial in his day, but more often than not, there were responses, debates. That's how I ended my comments as well.
Thank you all. We've gotten this next question 3 times, so I feel like it gets to move to the top of the queue because it's an urgent one for our participants. But they say, and this is just sort of addressed to everybody, do you think the Broadway musical does a sufficient job of distinguishing historical fact from artistic liberty? What parts of the musical do you find most accurate? And on the contrary, was there any aspect that was not? And then this might be a kind of way of rounding it out. What challenges, perhaps for Markas, go into creating and producing an historical musical where fact and fiction have to be balanced in the production? I know that was a lot of text at one time, but we got the question 3 times. So they're asking about our historical fact and artistic liberty. Are there parts of the musical that are accurate, parts that are just sort of baldly inaccurate? We could start there. to your knowledge anyway?
I mean, like, I guess you can certainly, I think, sometimes the order of events is not quite right. The exact characterization of the issues is not quite right in some of the rap battles. But I think that's sort of like parsing it a bit too finely. I think that the power of the musical is as a sort of continuous stream of thought in a highly creative in a highly creative form of delivery that doesn't really offend my historical sensibilities. However accurately I might ask a student to hew to the correct order of events and the causes of things. I think the musical is trying to do something else. It's trying to sort of speak to broader cultural themes that Markas, I think, referred to. And, when you do that, you have a few more degrees of freedom that we should allow you because you're trying to do something else as well as tell a story, an accurate story.
Yeah.
Well, I'll add a comment as well. I had read the Chernow biography, maybe a year or so prior to seeing seeing Hamilton, and I saw it on the Disney Channel offering. So I never got to see it live on stage. That would have been fun. But and I remember, I when I started watching it, my thought was, I'm going to be entertained. That was that's how that was my thought. But as I was being entertained, as I was watching all of the action unfold and listening to the music, the Chernow would jump back into my mind, and I'd say, oh yeah. So I can't say that I had a clipboard and I was kind of checking off different things, but no, there was nothing that was really flagrant where I thought, no, I was entertained, and I was truly entertained, and would have gladly watched it again. I haven't watched it a second time. Maybe I will, but no, that's how I approached it. And artistic license, and we all know that happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you all for those answers. Markas, here's one for you that relates to some of the things that you talked about, and I think especially that Nevin talked about. But they're curious about how sound effects are done manually in live performances. How common is that, and how difficult is that? Can you take us through the process of how manual sound effects are done? You pointed out these performances go on night in, night out. What's that process like?
Well, I am not a sound designer, and I don't even pretend to be one on TV. And so, and when it comes to things, particularly audio, visual stuff, I'm really a fish out of water, because I still draw with a pencil, not with a tablet. So, from my limited knowledge, and again, I'm going to take the clue from what Nevin said in his talking about that reverb during Burr, and the fact that they figured out a way to do it live, and how challenging it is to do a live reverb with a mix and everything else. So I take that to mean that it's incredibly difficult to do. And I know that, whenever I do any piece, whether it's a play or a musical, that where there are sound effects involved, whether it be, a gunshot or a flock of birds or an explosion or whatever it is, they're always pre-recorded sounds. Mm-hmm. Very, very rarely are there ever their kind of live Foley sounds, because there's so much that can't be controlled. And so, especially when it comes to timing and exactitude, that oftentimes we rely on the pre-recorded because it's exact and you can count on it, and that when you push it on this beat, it's going to last for a fraction of a second, and that's it. And so anyway, that's just my long-winded answer of saying I have no idea.
Well, there's a related question, which I suspect you would have a better idea about, which is the difference between doing costuming for a historical production versus a fictional one, and what is the process by means of which you do the research and decide on how the costuming works. You mentioned that you had worked on some fictional productions, and of course this is an historical one. So are the processes different? And just in general, how does the process work for those of us who have no idea about that?
Well, I think that regardless of whether, it's, what you're doing is a try to be a true depiction of an event or a fantastical event, that your research is just as deep and as sound for a historical event as it is for a make-believe event. Like, you still have to do your work regardless. And so, and in many ways, it's almost harder to do it in make-believe worlds because you got to make it up, you got to find it. Whereas history is there to be sourced. And so, but it is deep. You do have to dig in to try to figure out a point of view. And, and I think some of this maybe goes back to this idea of truth, is that, it's, Lin-Manuel Miranda wasn't creating a historical event for the History Channel. He was creating a piece of entertainment. And so that means that, as Taylor was saying, some events are out of order. And so that's done to tell the story better. Like, you take things and you rearrange them because that's a better way to tell the story. And so therefore characters get shifted a little bit, to tell the story, and because, Jefferson, like, being all of a sudden a big, being like kind of obnoxious and cocky and his like bright fuchsia long satin coat, they make him kind of obnoxious for a reason in that moment, right? And so he could have easily been in a nondescript black jacket at that moment. But how would that wouldn't have told the story in the same way, right? And so did Jefferson walk around in a floor length, fuchsia satin jacket? Probably not. But it's an invention that Paul Tazewell created because that was the best way to tell the story, right? And so in the end, that's what we do as designers and as storytellers, is that we're there to tell a story. And the story within the confines of what we're telling is the truth we're going for. Not the historical truth in history books, but we're going for the truth in the book, in the story we're telling at that moment. And 15 different stories about Hamilton are going to give you 15 different looks and impressions and personalities, right? And that's the way it should be, because if they all look the same, then that's some lazy designing, as far as I'm concerned. It should be different. So that's my thought there.
Thank you. I'll defend Jefferson's color taste. Monticello has a bright yellow dining room. When you walk in, Jefferson had a bright yellow dining room. And it's like, what? So he might have worn fuchsia if he could have. I don't know.
Yes, it was, because that lemon yellow was newly invented. It was a newly invented pigment. So it's one of the most expensive colors of the day.
Yeah. I don't put fuchsia past Thomas Jefferson.
No.
All right. There's a couple of questions here that might fall in some ways into Elizabeth's wheelhouse, but somebody mentions Hamilton's reputation as what they call, I like this term very much, an uber realist among the founding fathers, the realist of the bunch. And I wonder if you might speak to that, either Elizabeth or Taylor. Why is it that Hamilton has this reputation, as kind of the cutthroat founding father? And maybe if you're familiar with the things he writes, as I begin to think about it, where are some places where this reputation comes out as kind of the ultimate Federalist realist?
Well, I'll say, I guess the political sociologist in me says, hey, look at his upbringing. He had experiences that very few people who contributed to the founding actually had. With his birth in the West Indies, raised by a mother under, very difficult circumstances. But what singled him out very quickly in the eyes of folks who employed him were, his really very capable intellectual abilities. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was so prolific in his writing. But because of that, he was sent to the United States to be educated. But for that, he would have probably stayed in the West Indies, doubtful. Maybe he would have come to America, but doubtful. And, regardless of how, I know some people will pause at wanting to attribute so much, but I don't think we can discount what one sees as a child in very harsh conditions. And whether it's, whether it's just something always in the recesses of one's mind, or if in fact it's something that really marks one, it's always hard to say. So I think that's one feature that we have to that distinguishes Hamilton from many of the others with whom he, spent his life sparring. Also, one of the reasons why I took time to kind of go through that, timeline of events, the various professions that he experienced, he was in the military, he was on the battle lines, and he saw the straitened circumstances of the soldiers. He saw that, there was never sufficient funding to clothe them properly and so on and so forth. It was just a real struggle. So there again, Madison didn't fight, Jefferson didn't fight, and I'm not disparaging them. They simply just didn't. And also to serve in state legislatures as well as national legislatures, all of these experiences really brought him to, I'll use the word a realization that these governmental policies matter. And they can either be done, policy can be formulated to better the lives of people or to not. And I think that was always one of his goals. Realist, sure, yeah, I'll go along with that word. Because of his direct experiences growing up, but as well recognizing that these policies can, have a dramatic impact on people's lives. And Taylor, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think I think we would have to know exactly what sort of realist is meant to mean here. But I think that as I sort of alluded to in my comments, that I think it seemed to be the case that he was always aware of the political constraints that his opponents faced, whether he chose to loosen his demands upon them. I think is maybe not always, but I was struck by so he had this document that he wrote that went on to some influence about sort of how to sort of found a society that could encourage manufacturing, sort of an outgrowth of some of the stuff that he wrote about in the report on manufacturers. And he seemed to be quite fond of putting in things like we're gonna have a board, right, that sort of makes decisions about allocating funding, and then we're gonna have a period and that board is going to exist for a period. And then, but I recognize that these kinds of things where rich people get together and allocate money is going to be have a lot of potential to be corrupt. And so after 7 years or after some number of years, they're going to have to reconstitute this board in a new under new rules, under reform, under revised rules, maybe with different people, right? So the first bank of the U.S. is subject to that, much to kind of contributing to turmoil in the U.S. financial system over several sort of 40 years into the future, ending with Andrew Jackson or something. He puts these sunsets in the charters for banks or for different kinds of organizations that he wants to create. And I think that sort of he was very concerned about sort of kinds of embedded corruption, right? And ways to try to innovate institutionally to combat that. And so, yeah, I guess he was a realist. I'm not sure if he was more of one than somebody else, but I can sort of see that applying.
Yeah, thank you. So here's a question that sort of asks our two of our panelists to reflect on the history. What this person says is the most discerning difference between politics today, and you might add economics today, and 200 years ago. What's the difference? The most discerning or salient differences between politics and economics today and 200 years ago.
I don't know how much this particularly has to do with Hamilton, but the U.S. economy of the late 18th century, early 19th century, through the middle part of the 19th century, is an agricultural economy, and so I think then if we want to relate this to sort of Hamilton's thinking, I think that anyone who had an idea about sort of industrial wealth being the foundation for modern society, say Hamilton, maybe as caricatured versus someone like Jefferson, or I don't think that exactly holds, but something like that distinction. Hamilton, in that sense, was very forward thinking and recognizing that his society looked a particular way, but that future society could look very, very differently, and that would necessitate, possibly government support for manufacturing, but certainly something like a modern financial system. I mean, that's something that the economy at his time didn't have. It didn't have a modern financial system. It didn't have one, for a while after him, but you can see the beginnings there of a modern financial system. Having a currency that is issued by a government that is backed by whatever promises or metals, and that does a bunch of things to facilitate the movement of capital around the economy, hopefully to the benefit of all concerned.
Yeah, that's very tough because from my perspective, I work very hard to introduce my students to these works. Tomorrow we'll be reading, Federalists 73 and 74 on the executive branch and on the presidency. And so for me, these works speak to us today as they spoke to those folks who were, contemplating ratification of the Constitution. So I'm one who brings these works and makes them current. So it's not a salient difference so much in the arguments that they were presenting, because we're still grappling with a lot of these arguments. So I try to make them real. I suppose one difference that I would point to is at the time of the founding, I think there was real hope, or there was a belief, and they were working toward this belief that slavery would die away. Sadly, it took a decidedly different turn, with folks arguing that there was a positive good argument for slavery. We saw that among those in the southern states. And I point to George Fitzhugh and John C. Calhoun. And so the salient difference is we can test their theories. Slavery is just one example. There are many others. We can test, like, okay, so they designed a limited government with enumerated powers. How has that worked out? Well, we can have a contrast. Well, this is what they thought, this is what they designed, but this is how it's actually worked out. So I suppose the salient difference is we've broadened the parameters of the debate, and one hopes that the Civil War informs us. I mean, I just published an article on Lincoln and his House Divided speech, and how we can take those same concepts of a house divided and apply them to our situation today, in which case we're very much a house divided. How do we overcome that? So we have more that we can bring into the debate. I think that's the greatest salient. That's the difference off the top of my head that I'd offer.
Markas, here's one for you that's of some interest to me, as somebody who follows these things as a layperson. But they say, now that Hamilton has been produced and distributed digitally and was a massive success, what does this mean for the future of live theater? Would this become a new trend? I think this is interesting in the context of the question of COVID. People are talking about film now and what's the future of movie theaters, but this person's asking the future of live theater given the digital distribution and success of Hamilton. Will that become a new trend, and how will that affect live theater?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the jury is still out. But what I do know is that, there will be some effects. Do you know what I mean? There will be some things that we will all take away from COVID times. This is going to change all of us, the way we have meetings, and the fact that we can now, faculty meetings might not be in person anymore. We can have 8 a.m. faculty meetings via Zoom, and that's not terrible, So there are some things that will change our life drastically. Ultimately, theater is about a live experience. Do you know what I mean? That really is what it is. And while the filming of Hamilton did a really good job of making it feel like you were in the room where it happened, part of that was because, they were filming a live performance as opposed to capturing something that was live, i.e. the way the Les Miserables movie was. And so that tried to do a similar thing, but I don't think it did it well. And so, but in the end, I think that the audience will never be satisfied with a recorded live experience. Do you know what I mean? That's why you go and see a film, because it's not trying to be live. It's trying to take us again on a journey that we buy into, an epic journey, right? And so the beauty about live performance, and whether it's a concert or whether it's a dance or a piece of theater or a musical, is that, you know, we are there as an audience communing in a moment. And that's part of what the beauty of live performance is about. It's not just about your experience with a live performer on stage, but it's your experience with the community there gathering it, your collective kind of energy, and your, you know, the palpitation that comes, whether it's nervousness or excitement or whatever it is. I mean, we can all feel that at times. And you know, the first time I saw Hamilton was at the Buell, you know, up in the balcony. And I remember, and I'd heard it quite a few times. I'd seen some bootleg videos, right? You know, that taken out of somebody's pocket, or, you know, camera in somebody's purse or whatever, right? And it gave you enough that made you feel like you were there, right? But then all of a sudden being there, you know, with 2,000 people or whatever, and having that communal kind of energy was remarkable and palpable. So you cannot create that on your couch with a sound bar, no matter how big your TV is and how big. And right. So there's people that will be happy never to have to go to a live performance again, right? But they also never really like to go in the first place. Right. And so I think for those of us who thrive on it, you're not going to be able to keep us away. You're not going to be able to keep us out of Red Rocks. You're not going to be able to keep us out of the Mary Rippon to see Shakespeare or whatever it is. Like that's a need that we have. And so I think that, you know, I think that we're here to stay. We've been around for a few thousand years. I don't think that, you know, one pandemic is going to completely change our industry.
Yeah.
I'll just add, it's the same thing in the classroom. I've had in-person classes that have had to go remote and in-person, and drive me crazy. But no, the energy in a class is the same sort of thing. I'll take that any day.
Any day.
Well, everybody, we have reached the end of our time. I want to announce the winner of the signed copy of Lin-Manuel Miranda Hamilton soundtrack. That is Katie McWilliams. So Katie, we will be in touch with you. We put everyone's name in a randomizer, so you know we're not messing around. And Katie, you won the signed copy. So look for an email. And since our host dropped, Taylor, you're going to have to end the webinar. So you can click into webinar. But let me just say thank you to all of our guests, to all of our audience. What a wonderful evening this has been. Everybody go watch Hamilton, read one of the great biographies. Thank you all so much. And thank you from the Benson Center. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank
Good night,
you.
all.